Hello class and welcome back to World History. Today we'll be talking about historic revolutions as we go further into Unit 2. Part 2 will be covering chapters 22.3 and 23. As we go through, I want you to think about our essential questions for this class in this video. How did Enlightenment affect the views on rights and government? What major effects did the American Revolution have on the French? And what effect did Napoleon have on future rulers and leaders? Take some time to look at our important vocabulary as you watch the video, and reminders that we have our Unit 2 test this week. Make sure you're checking your schedule daily, and grades for Unit 1 have been inputted at this time, so make sure you check your grades tab. Reminders that zeros mean assignments are missing. We can still turn them in. Let's get started. So first off, let's talk about the American Revolution. You should have talked about this in your 8th grade history class, so this should be a refresher. But there are 13 colonies that make up the British colonies, which would become what we now know today as America. During the Enlightenment age in the 16th and 17th century, two figures, John Locke and Thomas Hobbes, worked to develop ideas on what a government's actual purpose is. One of these ideas was this concept of life, liberty, and what they deemed the right to own property. Thomas Jefferson would then use these to declare that all men should have the right of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, and that the work of the government should be to protect these rights. This is fundamentally important because, as we talked about in our previous unit, the wars in Europe, specifically the 30-Year War and the Spanish Armada War, as well as some English Civil War, all resulted in a financial collapse in Great Britain. They were out of money. Their coffers were empty. This meant that they needed money, and the fastest way to do that was taxes. And so what they began to do is tax the colonies for different goods, such as sugar, tea, paper, and other items. The British colonies were angry about that and began to boycott these items, which in turn would cause the UK to punish them by taxing them more heavily or taxing other things. In return, the colonists began to say that the British were taxing them without representation, meaning that they had nobody fighting for them and their rights and their needs in the British Parliament against these taxes. Because of this, they began to get angry and fight back. And you had two major events that took place in Boston at this time that were caused and resulted in the revolution. First off, you have the Boston Massacre. This was a fight between British soldiers and Boston civilians. No one's quite sure who shot the first shot, but it did result in the death of multiple Boston civilians and very much angered the colonists. In retaliation, the Bostonians decided to have a rebellion, and they went on ships and took the tea that was on these British ships and threw them overboard while dressed as Native Americans. This was really bad for the British because tea was one of their taxed items. It was actually their heaviest taxed item, and it caused a lot of issues, and it was really detrimental to their bottom line and took a lot of money from them. And because of that, they got really angry and began to tax the colonists even more. These two events and a couple of others led to the first battle, Lexington and Concord, which become a major battle in the first battle of the war. Next battle that's very important is the Battle of Saratoga. This is kind of the turning point of the war. And then you have Battle of Yorktown, which is the final battle and kind of the surrendering of the British to the Americans. After the war, you have the establishment of the American Constitution, which was a new type of government constitution built on the idea of people rule. Remember before, in Europe, you had absolutism, or this idea of an absolute monarchy that ruled. And Americans decided they didn't want that. They wanted people rule and for the people to have the rights to rule themselves, specifically white males who own property. This influenced the French, who actually helped the Americans in their war. There was a lot of French soldiers who helped during the American Revolution. And so when they got home, they decided they wanted to do something similar. They started looking at their own government, specifically how their social classes worked. So in France, you had 3 estates of social classes: the clergy, the nobility, and the commoners. Clergy were people who were Catholic Church officials and such. Nobility is your kings, your queens, your lords and ladies. And then basically the rest of France were commoners. 98% of the population were commoners, and they basically paid the majority of the taxes. The nobility and clergy were rarely taxed, if taxed at all, and this repressed social structure kind of made it easy for the rich to grow richer and the poor to grow poorer, causing a huge gap in wealth. This is very true in sense of the king and queen of France. You have King Louis and Queen Marie Antoinette. And in 1789, a food shortage hit France, which caused it to not have enough food. And so people were not able to buy bread and buy necessary things. This began to anger the people. And in turn, you have the famous quote by Marie Antoinette, "Let them eat cake instead of bread," because if they didn't have bread, maybe they could eat cake. But in turn, that was the worst idea, because if they don't even have bread, how are they supposed to have eggs and sugar to make cake? This caused a lot of anger, and you have the storming of Bastille, which was a prison, an official mob, and an angry mob, and the official start of the revolution. The third estate, the commoner estate, actually met at a national assembly to write a constitution. King Louis thought he could stop this by locking the meeting room, but that didn't work, and the third estate had enough and was inspired by the American Revolution, decided to stand up for themselves and limit the power of the king. They wrote up the Declarations of the Right of Men based on the American Declaration of Independence and Constitution, and began to say, like, these are the things we want, you need to provide these things. It's important to note that the purpose of the Constitution was to limit the powers of the king, not to get rid of the monarchy itself. The American Revolution was to get rid of the monarchy. The French was to limit the powers of the king, not get rid of it. This worked for a little bit until this guy named Maximilien Robespierre was put in charge. He decided to dissolve the assembly and start the National Convention, and he decided to use fear to keep everybody in place. He ended up killing over 40,000 people, including King Louis and his wife, in order to strike fear in the hearts of people and get them to do what he wanted. This period was called the Terror. And so you have our first 2 phases of the French Revolution: the Republic, this establishment of the National Assembly, and the Terror, with Maximilian kind of killing people with using the guillotine. In 1795, a new body of government was established. You had 2 legislative bodies and 5-men directory that kind of took control. The idea was that these 5 men would rule instead of 1 person to limit power. That's why it was called the directory. It didn't really work. There was a lot of corruption, economic issues, and some of the other countries around them saw their directory as a threat to monarch absolutism and threatened to restore the throne and get rid of this kind of pseudo-monarch democracy. More of a republic, but still. They ruled for a little bit until 1799, when Napoleon came in and overthrew the government in order to save it, as he believed, and that's the introduction of our dictator. And those are 4 phases of the French Revolution: the establishment of National Assembly, the Terror, the Directory, and the dictator. With the dictator, we have the age of Napoleon. Napoleon did some good and some bad. Some good things that he did is he established peace with the church, kind of helped bridge that gap between those 2 groups. He established the Napoleonic Code, which was a uniform set of laws that kind of kept everybody in check. This worked really well to kind of keep out issues, as well as reestablish the government and economic peace after so long of terror and strife and disunion. He also established the national bank and improved education. The biggest thing he did was establish a meritocracy, which means that instead of people getting jobs because of connections or money, they earned a job based on their abilities, which was really important during this time and allowed for kind of more people who actually could do the job to have the ability, to have the wages and the space. Some bad things, though, is even though Napoleon did all this good stuff, he decided to basically wage war with the rest of Europe. He wanted to take over the entire world, become the emperor of the world for life, and he decided to use war to do that. And so he went out and spread out and conquered Spain and what is modern day Poland, what is modern day Italy, what is modern day some of modern day Germany, and he basically got all the way to Russia, spreading out and kind of marching before he got stopped. Russia, as you may know, is incredibly difficult to invade, especially in winter. It's almost impossible. And so he got all the way to Russia before he failed and was forced back to France. And he was greatly weakened by this. So during this time, several European countries around him formed an alliance to attack him, and he was defeated and exiled to Elba, which was a tiny island off the coast of Italy. He stayed there for a while before slipping back into France and gaining support of the French people and raising a second army. He would then fight against the British forces at Waterloo, ultimately begin defeated a second time, and be exiled to St. Helena. However, even with all of this, he did a lot of good. He was a major influencer and uniter. He used his powers and his abilities to unite the French people, to get them all together, and to kind of bring back the French after years of terror and killing and destruction and corruption. He established this Napoleonic Code, which many of its laws are still used today. It was a very good set of codes that helped gain civil connection and just kind of give peace. That being said, he also was a major influence for future dictators. He really influenced and created what is a modern day dictator. This idea of somebody who rules not by the people's rule, or not by heritage or legacy, but by strength and fear and basically killing anyone who got in their way. This would be a huge influence for Stalin, for Adolf Hitler, for Benito Mussolini, and would cause a lot of issues later on. But he would be one of the first dictators, as we consider in a modern day dictator, and have major influence because of that. So, a brief overview. There were multiple revolutions at this time, a lot of them influenced by Enlightenment values and ideas. These new ideas allowed for a new idea of what rule and what government should look like. America would use this to establish the American Revolution and greatly influence the French Revolution. There are 4 phases of the French Revolution: the Republic, the Terror, the Directory, and the Dictator. With the dictator, you have the rise of Napoleon, a new type of leadership under him, and a new set of laws and a new way of kind of trying to take control of the world. And through all of this, you have a dictator's legacy, what he did and how he created the legacy of this dictator that would influence a lot of major figures in World War I and World War II. Okay, that is it for our review. If you have any questions for me, please call or text me, come to office hours, or send me an email. Remember to take the completion quiz after this video, and if you have any questions, let me know. Have a great day.